Why do Africa's borders look the way they do? Why do so many run in straight lines, cutting across deserts, jungles, and whole nations without pause? During the winter of 1884, inside a chandelier-lit hall in Berlin, those lines were drawn with consequences that still shake the continent of Africa today. 14 nations gathered for what is now often called the Berlin Conference. Germany, Britain, France, Belgium, Portugal, Italy, Spain, and others. Not a single African ruler sat at the table. Yet with cigars and rulers, they carved Africa into pieces, reducing kingdoms, empires, and peoples into spheres of influence. Those decisions lasted only 3 months on paper, but their impact never ended. The borders they drew were not erased with independence, nor with time. They still shaped the wars, politics, and disputes of modern Africa. This is how a scramble for land turned into a conference that divided a continent. By the late 19th century, Europe was restless. The Industrial Revolution had created booming factories, but also a hunger for raw materials. Coal, copper, rubber, ivory, palm oil, and gold were in constant demand, and Africa had all of them. For centuries, Europeans stayed near Africa's coasts. The interior was another world entirely. Malaria made travel deadly, the terrain was unforgiving, and powerful regional kingdoms defended their lands. For generations, those barriers kept Europeans from moving inland. But in the 1800s, the balance began to change. Quinine finally gave Europeans a way to survive malaria. Steamships turned rivers, once obstacles, into pathways deep into the continent. And new weapons, from breech-loading rifles to the Maxim gun, shifted military power firmly in Europe's favor. Places that had seemed unreachable were suddenly open to conquest. Colonial ambition in Africa wasn't new. Portugal had maintained outposts along the coasts since the 15th century, and both Britain and France had long traded there as well. What changed in the late 19th century was the pace and the scale. The race was no longer for coastal footholds, but for the interior of the continent itself. Britain sought to secure its lifelines to India and Egypt. France dreamed of building a horizontal empire that stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Red Sea. Germany, unified only in 1871, wanted colonies to prove its strength as a new power. And Belgium's King Leopold II launched a private venture in the Congo, presenting it as philanthropy while preparing a brutal rubber empire. The justifications were lofty. Missionaries spoke of saving souls, politicians promised progress, and writers leaned on social Darwinism to argue that European dominance was part of nature itself. But behind those claims lay the real motives: markets, prestige, and resources. By the 1870s, the land rush was accelerating. Europeans planted flags, signed treaties with local rulers that were often misleading or forced, and laid claim to rivers and valleys as their own. France pushed deeper into West Africa, while Britain advanced south and east. Germany entered the scramble late, but with determination, unwilling to be left behind. The result was a tangle of overlapping claims and the growing risk that European rivals would clash with each other. It's important to pause here and clear up a common misconception. Africa was never empty land waiting to be claimed. It was a continent of thriving kingdoms and empires. The Ashanti in the west, the Zulu in the south, the Sokoto Caliphate in the north, and many more. Europeans often ignored or dismissed these realities because they complicated the map they wanted to draw. That dismissal, more than anything, is what brought them to the conference table in Berlin. So, why Berlin? The scramble for Africa was pushing Europe toward conflict. France and Britain nearly came to blows in West Africa. Portugal's centuries-old coastal claims ran headlong into Germany's new ambitions. With tensions rising, Otto von Bismarck, the German chancellor, stepped in. In November 1884, he invited the major powers to Berlin. Historians still debate Bismarck's motives. Germany was not as invested in colonies as Britain or France, at least not yet. But by hosting the talks, Bismarck placed Germany at the center of European diplomacy. The conference would also keep rivals in check, forcing them to negotiate on paper instead of colliding in the field. Even the United States received an invitation, though only as an observer. Its seat was symbolic, a nod to its ties with Liberia and to the idea that Africa's fate was a matter of global interest. In reality, the decisions rested firmly with the European powers. What was absent is just as telling. No Africans were invited. Not a single kingdom, empire, or chiefdom had a representative in Berlin. It was a conference about Africa, but without Africa itself. For 3 months, from November 1884 to February 1885, diplomats gathered in Bismarck's residence to debate Africa's future. The atmosphere mixed formality with casual arrogance. Many of the men had never set foot beyond Africa's coasts, yet they sketched lines across territories they barely understood. The issue on the table wasn't whether Africa should be colonized. That process was already in motion. The question was how to divide it without dragging Europe into war with itself. The result was the General Act of the Berlin Conference. It laid down a set of rules. Any claim to territory had to show effective occupation. A flag on a map wasn't enough. To keep it, you needed forts, soldiers, and administrators on the ground. The Congo and Niger rivers were declared open to trade. It sounded generous, but it was really about keeping key routes available to all powers. The slave trade was to be suppressed. On paper, it was a humanitarian clause. In practice, forced labor continued under new colonial systems. But beyond the paperwork, the most lasting outcome was the map. Delegates drew straight lines and geometric shapes across Africa. They traced rivers, longitudes, and latitudes. Boundaries that were easy to measure in Europe, but meaningless on the ground. Ethnic groups, trade networks, and cultural regions were split apart or forced together with little thought. It's important to be clear here. The Berlin Conference did not colonize Africa outright. Armies and administrators would do that in the years that followed. What the conference created was a framework, a legal cover for conquest. And within 2 decades, that framework had allowed European powers to claim nearly 90% of the continent. On paper, the new map looked orderly. France claimed vast stretches of West Africa. Britain pursued its vision of a vertical empire from Cairo to Cape Town. Germany secured colonies in the east and the southwest. Portugal dreamed of linking Angola to Mozambique. Italy carved out a foothold in the Horn of Africa. But the order was only an illusion. The Somali people found themselves split between British, Italian, and French control. The Yu were divided between British Ghana, French Togo, and German Togoland. The Yoruba were cut between British and French territories. These borders were not mistakes. They reflected a simple disregard for the realities of life on the ground. It's worth asking whether the diplomats in Berlin even understood what they were doing. In some respects, they didn't. Maps of Africa's interior were often vague, and much of the land remained unfamiliar to Europeans. But it wasn't complete ignorance. Explorers, missionaries, and traders had long described Africa's diverse societies. That knowledge was brushed aside because it complicated the negotiations. Straight lines were easier to draw. In the end, the fate of millions of people was condensed into a handful of lines on a map. The Berlin Conference closed in February 1885. Agreements had been signed, borders drawn, and principles declared. But those decisions were only words on paper until they were carried out. What had been settled in Berlin now had to be enforced on the ground. In 1880, Europe controlled only a fraction of Africa, about 10%, limited mostly to small trading posts and coastal enclaves. Within 2 decades, that share had surged to nearly 90%. The conference hadn't just divided the map, it had opened the door to a wave of conquest. Soldiers pushed inland, companies rushed to extract resources, and colonial administrations followed behind to lock in control. France expanded into a vast West African empire that stretched from Senegal across the Sahara and down toward the Gulf of Guinea. Britain consolidated its hold on Egypt and the Nile while pursuing its vision of a Cape to Cairo corridor, a chain of colonies running unbroken from north to south. Germany, new to colonial competition, seized territories in East Africa, Southwest Africa, and Cameroon. Portugal tried to revive its fading coastal presence by dreaming of a link between Angola and Mozambique, though in practice, that connection never materialized. Italy planted colonies in Eritrea and Somalia, but its push into Ethiopia ended in disaster at Adwa in 1896. One of the rare moments when an African army decisively defeated a European power. And then there was Belgium. Perhaps the darkest outcome of Berlin was the recognition of King Leopold II's claim to the Congo. Officially, it was not a Belgian colony, but the personal possession of Leopold himself, presented as a humanitarian project to fight the slave trade and bring civilization. In reality, it became one of the most brutal regimes in modern history. The Congo was rich in rubber, ivory, and minerals, and Leopold's agents demanded impossible quotas from its villages. When those quotas weren't met, punishment was swift and devastating. Soldiers cut off hands as proof of discipline. Families were taken hostage. Entire villages were burned. Over the course of Leopold's rule, between 1885 and 1908, millions of people died from violence, forced labor, starvation, and disease. News of what was happening eventually reached Europe. Missionaries and traders carried stories back, and whistleblowers began documenting the atrocities. Writers like E.D. Morel and activists like Roger Casement exposed the system to the wider world, fueling international outrage. By 1908, the pressure was too great, and the Congo Free State was taken out of Leopold's personal control and placed under the Belgian government. But the damage had already been done. The Congo stood as a symbol of the horrors that colonialism could unleash, and it all traced back to the agreements made in Berlin. It would be a mistake to think Africa simply fell quietly under European control. Across the continent, resistance movements erupted. The Zulu fought fiercely in southern Africa, though they were ultimately defeated by the British in 1879. The Asante Empire resisted multiple British invasions in West Africa before finally being annexed. In Sudan, the modest revolt in the 1880s nearly toppled Anglo-Egyptian rule. In West Africa, Samurai Touré built a powerful state that resisted French advances for years before being captured in 1898. These stories are often overshadowed in the larger narrative of partition, yet they remind us of something essential. Colonization was resisted at every step. Across the continent, African states and communities fought with determination and strategy. What ultimately gave Europe the advantage was not a lack of resistance, but the scale of its industrial weapons and the reach of its global networks, forces that shifted the balance of power. The new borders often forced together groups with little shared history. In Nigeria, more than 250 ethnic communities were placed under a single administration. In Sudan, Arab populations in the north were tied to African populations in the south, a division that would fuel civil wars a century later. In Rwanda and Burundi, colonial rule placed Hutu and Tutsi under the same system, with Belgian policies of favoritism and ethnic classification planting the seeds of future genocide. At the same time, borders cut apart communities that had long lived side by side. The Somali were scattered across British, Italian, and French territories, as well as Ethiopia. The U were divided between British and French zones. Families and trade routes that had once been united were suddenly separated by colonial frontiers. The combination of rival groups forced into the same states and unified communities split apart became the foundation for many of Africa's future struggles. By the mid-20th century, waves of independence swept across Africa. Ghana led the way in 1957, followed by Nigeria, Kenya, Congo, and dozens of others. But as new flags were raised, each nation faced the same difficult question: should the borders drawn in Berlin be redrawn now? In 1963, the newly formed Organization of African Unity gave its answer. The borders would remain. The choice was pragmatic. Redrawing the map risked igniting endless disputes, with every group demanding its own state. Keeping the colonial boundaries, however flawed, seemed the safer path. That decision avoided immediate chaos, but it also locked in the legacies of Berlin. Independent nations were left with frontiers designed in European capitals, not by Africans themselves. Even today, the shadows of Berlin stretch across Africa. Civil wars in Sudan and South Sudan trace back to divisions first hardened under colonial rule. In Nigeria, the Biafra War of the late 1960s was fueled by the forced unity of rival groups. Rwanda's genocide in 1994 grew out of colonial policies that had emphasized and deepened ethnic divisions. Border disputes still flare between Ethiopia and Eritrea, Morocco and Western Sahara, and in other contested regions. The legacy is visible in the economy as well. Colonial systems were built for extraction, not for development. Railways carried resources from mines to ports, but rarely connected African cities to each other. Roads and telegraphs were designed to serve European commerce. When independence came, nations inherited infrastructures that pointed outward to Europe, rather than inward to their neighbors. Politically, colonial borders are still invoked as explanations for instability, and there is truth in that. Yet the story does not end with Berlin alone. Internal politics, Cold War rivalries, and global economic pressures have all shaped Africa since independence. Still, the Berlin Conference remains the symbol of the original fracture, the moment when outsiders imposed a map whose lines continue to shape the continent. The Berlin Conference lasted only 3 months. Speeches were made, signatures exchanged, and agreements drawn up in the glittering halls of Europe. Yet, in that short time, decisions were made that would shape the future of Africa. The men in Berlin thought in terms of rivers, trade routes, and latitude lines. They were balancing prestige, empire, and commerce. What they did not see were the families who would one day be separated by those borders, or the communities forced into states with little shared history. On paper, the lines looked neat. On the ground, they became fault lines. Africa was divided not by invasion or revolution, but by negotiations in distant rooms. The leaders who made those choices are long gone, yet the borders they left behind remain, still shaping the destinies of millions today. Maps often seem neutral, like simple tools for navigation, but the map drawn in Berlin was not neutral. It was a product of its time, orderly on paper, but carrying consequences that would echo far beyond what its authors could have imagined. If you have ideas for other stories from history you'd like me to cover, let me know in the comments. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to subscribe. I've got more videos on similar topics coming soon, and you don't want to miss them. As always, thanks for watching.